Hello and welcome to this new video. We're going to make another episode of the opening principle series. This one will cover the principle of not moving the same piece twice. So, why do we even move the same piece twice? Well, usually it's to improve the piece, right? And improving our pieces is a worthwhile endeavor in general. But in the opening, instead of moving the same piece twice, it's almost always better to instead move a different piece, because that will give us a lot more in general in the whole position. Perhaps our pieces are not ideally placed, but having them developed at least somewhere is a lot better than not having them developed at all and having only one good piece. So let's take a look at what happens when someone moves around the same piece twice, and which it takes away time which he could use to develop something else. So this is a game between Alexander Alekhine and Frank James Marshall from quite a while back. So it started as a somewhat normal opening, knight f3, and now black decided on knight e4. So black has this kind of outpost on e4, and he wants to support the outpost with f5, b6, bishop b7, and wants to get some kind of Dutch setup. But there is a drawback with this move, of course. The knight was already developed. Instead, black should have developed something else, maybe just b6 to develop the bishop. This would be the Queen's Indian defense. d5 is also possible to take the center, and then look at development in a variety of ways. Now, white plays the interesting move, knight f to d2. And you may say, well, white is also moving the same piece twice, but there is a difference here, because white is attacking this knight, and if black wants to defend it with f5, then there will be certain weaknesses in his position. Also, if black takes, then white will be able to get one of his pieces out quite quickly as well. g3 was perhaps the most logical here, to develop the bishop to g2, looking at this knight, and we are likely to get some kind of stonewall type of position. Well, Dutch position. So knight f to d2, and bishop b4, and now black is trying to fight for this e4 square by pinning this knight, but instead he should have probably just exchanged it, because this strategy will not really work out. Queen c2, now developing the queen with tempo. In the previous episode we've talked about early queen developments. Well, this is not an early queen development, because it attacks a knight, which is more important than a pawn, and also the queen will not be used as a target for black's pieces on the c2 square. Black played d5, again stubbornly doing his plan, but he should have again perhaps exchanged pieces and played this position, or for example he could take with the we could take with the knight, and after castles white's advantage is not that big, black has decent development. f5 is also possible, knight c3 is likely to happen. But okay, d5, knight c3, and f5. So black really wants to keep his knight in the center, so white takes it, f takes, and this opens the f file for black, and black has a certain space advantage at this moment, but white has a development lead with two pieces against one, and here it's white to move, so he develops another piece, the bishop to f4, and now after castling e3, c6, black wants to defend the center just in case, and after bishop e2, white only needs to castle to finish his development, whereas black still needs a lot of moves to develop his queen side. And after knight d7, we know that we should strike at the center when we have a lead in development, and instead black should have probably exchanged this bishop, although after bishop d6 and castles followed by f3, white still has a nice advantage. But in the game, black develops a knight, and now after a3, black goes back to e7, he cannot go to d6 anymore. If he takes here, white will just recapture, having the bishop pair, and probably will play b4, b5, as well as f3 at some point, and this should really favor white. So bishop b7 happens, castles. Black plays bishop g5, moving us around the same bishop twice. This has the aim of developing the queen, perhaps, and then the knight after the queen. Or if the bishop moves, then this bishop will have been slightly improved. But now white finds a very good move. You can pause the video, try to figure out what to do. And white's move is especially logical because he knows the opening principles. When we have a big lead in development and our opponent's pieces are not developed, we open up the center, and here f3 was the whole point. And here black can win a pawn for a second, but this doesn't really work out very well. Black took on f4. If black takes here, we can just take back. It's gonna be similar to a different variation. White took back. Again, there is big tension here. Black has to do something. If black takes here, this is probably relatively best. White will take back, and due to this poor light squared bishop, the outpost on e5, and the very weak pawn on e6, white is quite a bit better in such positions. Otherwise, if e3, this looks kind of logical, but after g3, this pawn is way too advanced, and it will be picked up in a short while. So rook takes f4. White opens the f-file, he gains back the pawn. Rook f1, basically forced, rook f1. And now we see the position has clarified a little bit. White has all of his pieces developed. Black has basically the knight developed, which is only hindering the rest of the pieces. The rook is far away in the corner. The position is opening up. There is a lot of tension in the center. So white's lead in development already gives him a huge advantage. Here black plays the move e5, which is interesting but still not very good, as black's pieces are not prepared for such a fight in the center. Queen d2 is played, keeping the d4 square. It might look interesting why white is not doing anything in the center, but currently any resolutions in the center don't really favor white, as the knight will be attacked here. Also, if here, then most likely d4 would be played, with the idea to put the knight on e5. So queen d2 improves the queen. It didn't have much scope here. Black plays c5. Also, if, for example, queen b6, this isn't great because of simple queen g5, threatening queen e7. White doesn't care about all of this. The aim is now the king, who has no defenders. But after c5, white now takes here. White could have won in a different way as well by taking here, and after black takes the pawn on d4, knight e4. This is basically winning. The threats are such as queen f4, queen f7. The knight may go to d6. This one can't move because both of these pawns would drop down. b4 is also an option to undermine the pawns, and this bishop can also either take the knight or go to e6. But white does this, d4, and now white finds a nice move, which is queen f4, giving up the knight, because again the king is the most important part of the game. He could move the knight, but then after knight e5, black sets up some sort of blockade. At least he will try, and if he gets the bishop developed, he will be kind of fine, especially in the long term. He does have a passed pawn here, a nice knight, so statically black is doing fine, but dynamically he has no development. So queen f4, well, black takes the knight, gives a check, and white here simply recaptures the pawn on c3. And if we look at this position, we will see that black is simply paralyzed. He still has no development, and this is the whole point. Even though black has more pieces on the board, in the context of pieces that are playing in the game, black is way behind. White has a bishop, a rook, and a queen, all of which are fulfilling some kind of purpose, while even though black has more pieces, the bishop and the rook are not doing anything, Not to mention white has this passed pawn on the e-file, so white is basically a rook and a passed pawn ahead. And black can't really do much here. The knight can't move because of checkmate, so queen g8 is played, queen e7, h6, bishop h5, activating the bishop as well, a5, trying to do this, but now e6. The knight can't really move. For example, if here, then we can take it, and after gf, queen f6, this is good enough, but also even better is bishop f7. This simply ends the game on the spot. So g6 is played, white takes the knight, black takes back, and the final move, rook f7, threatening checkmate, and there's really not much for black to do, so he decided to resign. In the next game we'll see a more modern example of moving around the same piece twice. So here we started with the Bogo Indian defense. So the point of this check is to induce some kind of chaos in white's position. If knight c3, then we would get a favorable version of the Nimzo Indian for black, but this is of course playable. Bishop d2 is the standard reply. That knight bd2 is more ambitious, keeping more pieces on the board. And here black plays c5, but this move is not considered very good. White plays a3, bishop d2, and now the position opens up a little bit. White has the bishop pair. He has this unopposed dark squared bishop, and if black doesn't do anything dynamic, then long term white will have a pretty significant advantage with his unopposed bishop pair. d5 is played, black takes the some center and develops the queen with tempo. Here white plays knight c2, which is an interesting idea. The point is to put the pawns like this, f3 and e4, and then try to restrict black's pieces, and then eventually put the knight on e3 or somewhere else. e3 is the standard move, keeping the knight on d4 and aiming to develop the pieces normally. Here black plays the move knight e4. The point of this move is to do something to white's position before he is able to fully develop, but this doesn't really work out. Here black overrates the strength of white's bishop pair, and instead he should have played normally and continued his development. For example, after castles, white would likely play f3, trying to play e4, queen h5, e4, and after, for example, rook d8, black is quite well developed. The pin on the d-file is a bit annoying for white. He is not able to develop very harmoniously. And here an interesting variation is queen e2, knight c6, h4, trying to attack this queen with g4 next, and after e5, black can sacrifice a piece like this, and we get this type of interesting position. Black is better developed, white's king is in the center, but white does have a piece, and his development is not that terrible, so it's not clear what the outcome of this should be. But instead black plays knight e4, and moving the same knight for the second time. White answers with bishop e3, queen e5, b4, queen c7. So this was black's point. He moves around the queen a few times, but he creates threats in the process. Now queen c3 is annoying. Black is always trying to take back the bishop pair. Queen d3, f5, stabilizing the knight, but the knight has to go back anyway, and white has to finish development. He plays bishop c5 to free the e-pawn, and also now we see black is not able to castle, and this unopposed dark squared bishop is being quite annoying. b6, bishop d6, white plays b5, rook c1, putting the rook on the open file, and as you can see, black's pieces are not feeling very well here. This knight has taken quite a lot of time. This time could have been spent a lot better by developing the pieces and the king. King f7, as there is no other way to develop the rook. Knight b4, white goes forward, and rook d8. So that there was a threat of rook c7, now it doesn't do much as black will take and the queens will be exchanged. And here white had prepared a very nice move, and which is e4. The idea is to open up the light squared bishop while not losing time, as now there are threats of, for example, e5, which would stabilize the d6 bishop forever. And so black doesn't really want to allow this, but this pawn cannot really be taken, for example, after this and now. If black takes with the knight, then after rook c7, takes, and queen f3, this in-between move is extremely important. The queen is now out of the pin, and white will take the queen. So taking with the knight is impossible due to this fork, and if here, then queen takes, and importantly, we take this knight, and at the end of all this, there is a fork on c6. So the pawn cannot be taken. This was important to calculate. So knight e8 is played, e5, stabilizing the bishop, and here black is basically busted. King g8 is played. Notice how his pieces are all undeveloped, and he cannot really develop them. For example, then into knight c6. So king g8 is played, queen c3. Black takes, but he cannot take back here because of the hanging bishop. Again, black is having trouble developing. After this, knight c6 would be extremely annoying. So a5 is played, but white takes en passant. He cannot really take back because of the bishop on f1. So queen d7, and we can see that black's position is horrible. And after the knight goes to c6, black finally resigns. So quite a quick game here. Again, black is moving around the same piece twice. Generally, this is not a good idea. Of course, sometimes grandmasters do this, but these are exceptions. We only do this if we have a concrete justification. In general, we should be abiding by the opening principles. Another one of these games, going back to the past again, a game by the world champion Botvinnik, started as the English, the so-called reverse dragon variation, bishop g2, bishop e6, knight f3, knight c6, castles. And here black plays knight b6. So even though black hasn't developed all of his pieces, he is already moving the same piece twice. And there is a question of why. But here it was quite important, because after the natural bishop e7, white has the strong move d4. And after several exchanges, white will be ahead because his bishop will have been opened and his pieces will be extremely active. The queen is likely to go to d4. So this is something black wants to avoid. So knight b6, and black has time, when d4 is not a threat, black has time to develop his pieces. So d3, bishop e7, a3. Standard idea by white, trying to play b4, and perhaps developing the bishop to b2. Here black plays a5, but this is an unnecessary weakening of the light squares, specifically b5, and maybe even c6. And here black shouldn't really fear b4. For example, castles b4, f6. Black has a very normal and solid position, aiming for knight d4 at a good moment. So instead a5, bishop e3, castles, knight a4, quite a standard move in these openings. To develop the queen, also to open the c-file for our rook, and this knight can always go back to the center. So black takes, bishop d5, contesting the long diagonal, rook fc1. Notice how white uses this rook, not this one, because the play will be on the queen side. The rook on f1 would be useless after rook ac1. Rook e8, rook c2, bishop f8, and rook ac1. So we have quite a quiet English position, and black's play should be oriented in the center, as he has this strong pawn here. And he can, for example, play h6 to stop the knight from going to g5 at any point, and the game goes on. Instead, black plays this move, knight b8. And black's idea is to play c6 and then redevelop the knight somewhere, and c6 would stop white's play on the c file. So this was black's point. But now white takes this pawn on c7, and you might be wondering, why did black blunder a pawn? Well, this wasn't a blunder. The point was that now bishop c6 traps this rook on c7, and black was hoping to win exchange like this. Now the queen is attacked and the rook as well. Knight c6 was also possible, giving up another pawn, but now after rook b7, knight d4, now the rook is attacked. Also knight takes e2 is a big threat, and here white can take on d4, and after this white will recapture, black will capture here, when white can take here. Now the rook is attacked, rook b8, and the bishop will go back to defend the pawn on e2, and we can evaluate this position as extremely good for white. He has 3 pawns for the exchange, he has the bishop pair, and all of white's pawns are very healthy. He has a big majority in the center, and not to mention the pawn here as well, which is very safely guarded. Black has no targets, so it will be extremely hard to play. So in the game, black plays bishop c6, which is probably what was planned, but now white takes this bishop, and after bc, black has won an exchange, I wanted to say, but now white has a pretty good idea, which he uses. Rook takes f7, and this is winning without any complicated variations. White could also go rook b7, but this is of course a lot more convincing. Always check the checks, captures, and attacks. And now we can see that black's undeveloped pieces don't really help the king side, as they are too far away. And what is the point here? Well, king f7 would run into queen c4. This is not really possible because of a discovered check. Otherwise, here. Where else can the king go? Here. If here, then queen g4 would be mate. Knight g5, and black will probably have to give up the queen. For example, if here, then this would end in not only a queen, but also the checkmate on g8. So black decides to play h6, but this ended quite quickly. Rook b7. White of course has general compensation for the exchange. All of black's pieces are on the first rank. White has the unopposed light squared bishop, which will go to e4. The queen is extremely strong, and the rook is on the 7th rank. Queen c8, check, and knight h4. So this is the most effective way to win, though other moves work as well. For example, rook f7. But knight h4, giving up the rook on b7, check, and bishop e4. This was the point. Now black moves the bishop as it was threatened. Also, the biggest threat is probably knight e7 to threaten queen g8 checkmate. Well, this would also be a check. Knight takes e5, g6, bishop g6, and the last move, bishop takes h6, another check. White picks off all of the pawns, and here if black takes back, then after queen h4, white at least wins the queen, though he can probably even do more than that. So thanks for watching. Hopefully these games were instructive, and hopefully you do not move around the same pieces twice without having a good reason.